Hi, my name is Zander and I am a CS student at the University of Central Florida. I'm going to be showing off an application I made called Inventory Manager, which is for object-oriented programming. So as you see, I am cloning the repo right now, and we saw that the file was added correctly. This project uses JavaFX to allow the user to use an interface to add, edit, and remove items from an inventory, and also import and export files related to the import inventory. So as we see, after I go to my documents, I can show off my plant UML diagram, which it is a little clustered. However, most of my work occurs in the inventory management application controller, or the main stage. So if I move over to our first class, we have the inventory management application, which the inventory management application simply just starts the program, starting the window, sets the title, sets the application icon, and sets the fonts. Gets the fonts working. In the inventory in this long class, we have the main menu, which contains various functions for accessing the user guide, as shown from About button clicked, adding items, setting items to the table, importing, exporting, deleting, etc. So if we go to About button clicked, we have the About controller, which contains a list of HTML guides for accessing or for various parts of the program and accessing various parts, being able to utilize it to its fullest potential. And it contains a web view in order to see each of the HTML items. So after initialization, it adds all of the guides that are created for the program to the list, and then whenever a user clicks on an item in the list view, they can see the HTML guide for it. Speaking of guides, our guide class is simply just a title and a local HTML, and it's just used to organize the program a little more. Moving on, we have Add Item button clicked. So after the user types in text fields in the main menu for adding an item and clicks Add Item, it'll take it to the validator, which the validator, as shown in the diagram, contains only methods that validate various aspects of the items. So the validation for the name is that the name has to be between 2 and 256 characters. And if it's not, it returns null, otherwise it returns the name. And this is the same for the rest of the values. Whenever verifying the value of the object, if the number is not a number, or if it's less than 0, then it'll return null, otherwise it'll return the value. For serial, if it doesn't match the format A-XXX-XXX-XXX, whereas A is a letter and X is a number or a digit, then if it doesn't match that pattern, then it'll return null. And for unique, if the serial number provided is not unique, it will return null. And so if all the validator cases are correct and work correctly, then the item will be added to the table and thus the inventory. Otherwise, an alert will appear. A pop-up will appear specifying the errors. Clear item button clicked just makes an alert pop-up to verify that the user wants to clear all the items, and if yes is clicked, all the items will be cleared. Clear search button clears the search field. Close button closes the stage. Delete item button clicked. So each item has a checkbox associated with it, or a simple Boolean property. So if we go to item right here, items have a selected Boolean property, and whenever it's true, aka the checkbox is selected, then that means it's primed for deletion. Items also have names, values, and serial numbers. Whenever the item is primed for deletion, if the delete button is pressed, it'll prompt the user if they want to delete those items, anyhow. But yeah, with the item's attributes, there are getters and setters for each attribute, including the simple Boolean property, the name, the value, the serial, and setting those values accordingly. Edit item button clicked sends the user over to the edit item controller, which is another stage. The edit item controller contains the selected item's attributes in text fields that the user can edit. And whenever the user clicks edit item, it'll show up it'll validate all the input fields, and if they work with the validator rules, then the stage will close and the new item will be edited. Otherwise, the same alert will appear as from the edit item button. If the user decides to click the delete item button, then it'll also show a pop-up asking if they want to delete the item. And if they click yes, the stage will close and the item will be deleted. And then these functions are simply just for if the user decides to press enter in the field, it'll display an error if the value input is incorrect. Initialization causes the text property of the name field to cause the name character counter to change the number of characters and also prevent the user from inputting more than 256 characters. And there's also getters and setters for the items, item lists, and item. Also setting the inventory controller as we want to refresh the table upon editing an item. So we also have the export and import functions, respectively, for HTML, JSON, and text. And those also move over to the file handler class, which the file handler class is simply just file handling. With a path and a list, any files can be accessed that as long as they are text files, HTML files, or JSON files. So for import, depending on what the user selects, it'll either import the text, the HTML, or the JSON file. And the files that will be imported look similarly to this. So whenever exporting, we have our tab separated values. For our text file, we have our HTML file in a table for each item, and our JSON file that's created from the JSON parser, JSONFX. So essentially, it'll import those files depending on what was chosen. And it's very similar for file export. There's a hub that'll determine whatever the user picks, the function to use, and then it'll export, writing the items to the file in the specified format. And in addition, export JSON just uses the FXJSON library as well. File export GUI just creates the file chooser for the user to choose a file for the export case. And then there's also getters for the lists, setters for the path in the list. We go back, we have importing as explained, and items button clicked, that just changes the view over to the items view. Sort name button, so all these sort buttons, they have checkers to determine the amount of times they've been clicked. If they've been clicked an odd number of times, then they're going to inversely sort. Otherwise, they're going to sort normally. And then we have initialize, which initializes the table, sets the pane for the accordion, and sets the search field so that it changes the table values. And then we have initialize table, columns, etc. And then we have item list, which item list has all the functions for modifying the inventory. We have add item, which you could either do in a string or by supplying an item. Remove items, which whenever you supply a list of items, it'll remove all the items from the list. Clear, which clears the list. Sort by name, which sorts the list by name in alphabetical order. Inverse, which is in reverse. Sort by value, which is in ascending order. Sort by value inverse, which is in descending. Sort by serial and alphabetical and reverse. Then we have search item, which returns true or false depending on whether or not the search is included in the item's name or serial number. And then we have create predicate, which makes a predicate for the filtered list that determines whether or not the item will show up in the list in the table. And we also have getters for the observable list, the list, and the setting. Our test values are all determined by our helper functions and our data functions, classes. So if we go to our item list tests, you can see that we are testing the capacity of the item list. So we add 10,000 items using this ridiculous for loop, and if there's any error, then the test will fail. Adding items is just verifying that the items added show up correctly. Removing, the same thing, but with removing. Clearing just makes sure that the test clears correctly, or the item list. Sort by name ensures that the items will appear in 1 to 5 order. Inverse will be 5 to 1. Sort by value will be 50, 75, 100. And then inverse will be 100, 75, 50. Sort by serial would be A, K, Z, and then Z, K, A. Creating a predicate just means also that if I type in Scoob, it'll show up with the items containing Scooby-Doo and Scoob in their names. With file handling, it's very similar to what was explained earlier. A list is created for each test, and then essentially the file is exported, and there's an expected file, or there's an expected string that the export needs to match, and if it matches in here, then the test will succeed. Same thing with HTML and JSON, whereas they need to match these outputs. And importing just uses the files. Provided that they succeeded, then the import should succeed by using the import functions. But we have testing, getting these items into an inventory, and then making sure that everything works correctly. And then it's the same thing for the HTML and JSON. For the validator, it's just using the validator rules. We have the verify name test, which just makes sure that like test would be successful because it's between 2 and 256 characters. Meanwhile, A would be null, and this long thing would be null. For value, it's just as long as the value is greater than or equal to 0. For verify serial, it's just as long as the serial value matches the format. And then verify unique test is making sure that the value is unique in the list, otherwise it'll return null. So given that information, we can now show our verification, or show our tests. Our tests, they complete, they're verified, so we can now run. So this is my inventory manager, which disappeared. As you can see, it's very uncanny, the resemblance. I've been just interested in 4X's recently, so I decided to just make all my applications this semester for JavaFX just look like various 4X's. Same thing applies to the About list, or the About page, which is a user guide that shows various things that you can do. If we move over to the Civipedia, it's very similar. I just enjoy the UI because it looks nice. So what we can do is that we can start adding a new item. So we can type in Zander and add a new item with the correct values. And given that they're correct, there's no issue in adding to the list. But if we decided to just go ham and just say A for each, we'll have an error box that says unable to add item due to an item's name being required, serial number, etc. And also, if I decide to play it smart and just add in a serial number and a new name, well, it'll show that the value is required still. So it depends on which ones are incorrect, which errors show up. If I decide to try to duplicate a serial number, then it'll also show an error, respectively. So what I can do is I can actually import items. So I have a variety of test cases here. So I have HTML, which shows that it works as expected. We can clear the items, which will clear the table, and then we can import them as a JSON, which shows these items. If we clear those items, we can again show it as a text, which shows these items as well. So this is editing. What we can do is that we can import our big list, which has the over 10,000 items shown earlier. And so what we can do is that we can select various items for deletion. If we click, it'll say, you want to remove the following items, then it'll say all the items. Click yes, and it'll delete them from the list. We can sort them by name. Of course, name's going to just be determined by the number. So like 1 is going to be higher than various values. Since I deleted 1, 1 would be first, and then 1, 0, 1, 0, 0, etc. Sort by value will be dependent on the value. 2's the lowest, 10,000 is the highest. Sort by serial number is also dependent on the alphabetical order. What I can also do is that I can also search for a test item. So I could just type in A-AAA-AA-0 hyphen, and I want to look for the 77th item. Well, that's the 78th item actually, because of how I programmed in an item, but still, it shows in the item as expected. So I can type in item 77, and it'll show every item with 77, which is quite a few. What I can also do is that I can export all these items as a text file, so I can, let's actually clear the items. What we can do is that we can add new items like Google A-GGG, and then we can export as text. Then we can put it in here, type in Google. So if we decide to clear the items, then we can import the items. And the same works for the HTML and JSON imports. So if I double click on Google, it'll actually take me to the editing page as shown earlier. And I can change the titles or the values, the names, etc. So if I decide to make them all completely blank, it'll show me the same error from before, unable to edit item and whatnot. But if I just decide to use values that work correctly, also I'm going to try and replicate the first serial value. We showed that you can't edit it to be non-unique. And you don't have to use capital letters, it's just I prefer that way. As we see, it updates as expected. I think one of the main things that I really learned this year in object-oriented programming was mainly learning how to use Java and obviously object-oriented languages. I only had experience with procedural generated languages, or procedural languages, like C. And I mean, I had a little bit of Python under my belt, but to be honest, it's just been a lot of fun, even if it's been so difficult trying to get all this working. There's just been a lot of work put into this class, and I've learned a lot in regards to styling and user interfaces, you know, taking into account even the tiniest details that, you know, a normal user would probably notice or probably get into, and the usual developer would be like, the user's smart enough. I think it's that sort of mentality that's definitely used in the workplace. And given that workplace experiment from object-oriented programming that I've learned from Dr. Hollander, it's definitely helped me envision a better work ethic for myself, I suppose, and a better mindset into what I could learn or what I could do in the future. What we could do is that we could export it as an HTML, because I can demonstrate that it shows up as a table. So if I go in here and go back to our inventory, so if we go to this one, we'll see that the table shows up as expected as well. And just for consistency, we can export as a JSON as well, which would be, and then for the items, import, and the items reappear. Also, this also demonstrates that the items, when importing, they clear. So yeah, that's my inventory management application. If you need any help with it, be sure to consult my user guide. I put in way too much time into getting the CSS to work. But thank you. Before I stop the video, you can also export the files as a JSON, just to show off that you can do so. Then after I clear all items, you can import, which we call it google.json, and it shows the values as expected. In addition, if you tried to put in a whole bunch of characters, like over 256 of them into the item field, and you put in other values that actually work. The name just won't work because it has to be between 2 and 256 characters. And also, it is possible to delete one item at a time. You don't have to select multiple. Also, this little checkbox works at the top. Thank you for viewing my video, and I'm very proud of this assignment. Have a great one.